So now I want to do the second Old Testament narrative talk. This one is, I want to talk a little bit about the Exodus narrative, because that's really one of the most important narratives for the identity of the Israelite people. In all likelihood, the Exodus took place between 1300 and 1280 BC during the reign of Ramses II. To put this in context, it probably wasn't all that uncommon for slaves or for clans to escape out into the desert. Okay, what's significant for Israel in the Exodus is not so much the escape, although that's important, but the involvement of God in the Exodus and the relationship between God and Israel that is expressed in the Exodus. Okay, this isn't just any escape from slavery. This is a divinely orchestrated escape from slavery. Now we can divide the Exodus narrative into 5 main sections. So the first is chapters 1 through 4. And that is about the childhood and the call of Moses. The next is chapters 5 through 12. And that section relates to the plagues and the struggle to free Israel. And then the high point of that narrative is the Passover. Okay, the third section is chapters 13 through 18, which discusses the escape and journey into the wilderness of Sinai. The next is the giving of the covenant and the laws, chapters 19 through 24. And finally, chapters 25 through 40 relate the instructions and building of the Ark of the Covenant and the tent of meeting, which later becomes the tabernacle, which later is replaced by the temple. So you notice right in the middle of this story is the giving of the law. And that's kind of what this centers on. Israel is out in the wilderness, but God makes covenant with them through the giving of the law on Sinai. You can go to Sinai today. It might not be the same Sinai, but it's in what's called Lower Egypt, and it's not far at all from Israel. I suppose if you're walking, it's a very long way from Israel, walking through the desert, especially if you're lost. But you have to climb up all these steps, just a jillion steps up this mountain. It's absolutely exhausting. And also, I'm not in great shape, so that didn't help. But you climb up all these steps and you get up to the top, and there's a little chapel up there. At the bottom, there's St. Catherine's Monastery, where they have some of the most famous icons in the world. It's an Orthodox monastery. It's really beautiful. A little hotel you can stay in there. Okay, Now, since the time of Joseph, Jacob's son, who had risen to power as chief overseer of Egypt, the Hebrews had been living in Egypt, and they've been living pretty well. But eventually, the memory of Joseph was forgotten by the pharaohs. So if we go to Exodus chapter 1, it tells us that the Hebrews are getting too numerous, and the Egyptians are concerned about them. And so the king of Egypt, verse 15, let me see here. So in verse 13, the Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites, made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks they imposed on them. And then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one who was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, she shall live. But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. Okay, but the Pharaoh still had a command that all the Israelite boys would die. Now, we see a parallel to this in the New Testament. Where is that?
After Jesus was born.
Right, the slaughter of the infants at the beginning of Matthew. King Herod. And that's why Jesus' family flees to Egypt. Okay, so Moses' life is immediately in danger after his birth. So his mother puts him in a basket of reeds and sends him down the Nile, and he's rescued by an Egyptian, one of the very people he will eventually overthrow. His mother is hired as his midwife, so that works out well for both of them. And then when he grows up, he kills an Egyptian who's beating a Hebrew. And so he flees to Midian, where he marries and lives. Now, the call of Moses is kind of reluctant, isn't he, when God calls him out of the burning bush. 4:10. Turn to 4:10. This is another example of God working through really unlikely people. First of all, Moses is a murderer. And secondly, Moses doesn't want to be called of God, and he may have a speech impediment. It's not clear. But the point is, again and again in these stories, all through the Bible, with people like Abraham and Moses and all Jacob and all the way to Paul, God works through really unlikely people. Rahab, Tamar, God works through really unlikely people. Ruth is another one. So when God calls Moses and says to him, "I want you to lead the people out of Egypt," verse 10, chapter 4, Moses said to the Lord, "O my Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor even now that you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." Then the Lord said to him, "Who gives speech to mortals? Who makes them mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord?" So basically what the Lord is saying is, your qualifications are irrelevant. That if I empower you, if I call you and empower you to do this, regardless of what's happened in your past, or regardless of what shortcomings you think you may have, you're going to do it. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, what of your brother Aaron, the Levite? I know he can. He's like, okay, fine. If you don't want to do it, get Aaron to do it with you. Aaron can speak fluently. Even now, he is coming to meet you. When he sees you, his heart will be glad. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you what you shall do. So God kind of makes a compromise with Moses on this. Okay, but you have to understand that Moses is being depicted here as, this is not a heroic figure, put it that way, right? This is not like David wanting to go out and fight Goliath. This is kind of the opposite of that. He's a very unlikely hero. So we get this long narrative. How are we on time, Marie?
We're only 12 minutes in.
We're 12 minutes in, okay. So we get this long narrative about Moses going to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and he doesn't want to let the people out of Egypt. And then God imposes the plagues upon the Pharaoh. And chapter 12, we get the institution of the first Passover. And this is really what finally initiates the actual Exodus. But it's a horrible plague because it's the death of the firstborn. As we read in 12:29, at midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. Pharaoh arose in the night, he and all his officials and all the Egyptians, and there was a loud cry in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. Then he summoned Moses and Aaron in the night and said, rise up and go away from my people, both you and the Israelites. Go worship the Lord, as you said. Take your flocks and your herds, as you said, and be gone, and bring a blessing on me too. Now, why aren't the Israelites affected by this? That's the point of the Passover. Okay, so they're given instructions about a ritual meal that they should eat. First of all, in 12:11, this is how you shall eat it. Your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it hurriedly. Now, why would they eat it hurriedly? Why do they eat with their sandals on and with their staff in their hand?
They're ready to go.
They're ready to go. Right. Because as soon as Pharaoh lets them go, they're going to have to go quickly. In verse 13, the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague shall destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So the blood of the lamb, which is, we use that in Christian symbolism, right? And we often think of it as a sacrificial lamb, but in fact, lambs were not what was sacrificed. It was, bulls and goats were sacrificed. So lambs are the Passover meal, but that's not a sacrifice for sin. Do you understand the difference? Like you would sacrifice a goat for sin, but but this isn't a sin offering. Okay? This is a ritual meal, and as they prepare the meal, they take the blood of the lamb, and it says in verse 21 or 22, take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and touch the lintel and the 2 doorposts with the blood in the basin. None of you shall go outside the door of your house until morning, for the Lord will pass through to strike down the Egyptians. When he sees the blood on the lintel and on the doorpost, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to enter your house to strike you down. So this is the initiation of Passover. And Passover celebrates God's leading the Israelites out of Egypt. And what keeps them safe from the wrath of God? The blood of the Lamb. So Christians have taken this symbolism too, and sometimes we confuse it with sacrificial blood. There's also sacrificial imagery in the New Testament, but the blood of the Lamb means that when Christians use that term, we mean that Christ's death saves us from God's wrath. Okay, any questions about this? In chapter 19, they reach Mount Sinai, and this is where God initiates a covenant between himself and Israel. In chapter 20, we get the 10 Commandments. And the 10 Commandments is kind of like the seedbed for the rest of the law. These are kind of the most basic elements of the law. So if we look at the first of these, chapter 3, you shall have no other gods before me. Second commandment, you shall not make yourself an idol. The third, you shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord. That's related to when we were talking about the swearing of oaths. And the name of the Lord is Yahweh. It's not God, it's Yahweh. In fact, in your Bible, when you see Lord in small caps, that is where it would have said Yahweh, but the Hebrew scholars revered the name of the Lord so highly they didn't even want to write Yahweh, so they wrote Adonai in its place, which means Lord. Okay. So really what it would have said is, you shall not make wrongful use of the name of Yahweh, your God. The next one is, remember the Sabbath day. Now, look at these first four. These first four commandments have to do with the relationship between human beings and God. This is what we call the first tablet or the first table of the law. Don't worship any other gods. Don't make idols. Don't make wrongful use of God's name. And remember the Sabbath day. In other words, God is the one who determines the order of your life, the rhythm of your week. Okay, then we get into commandments that relate to relationships between people. So the fifth commandment, honor your father and your mother so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. The sixth commandment, you shall not murder. Seventh commandment, you shall not commit adultery. 8th commandment, you shall not steal. 9th commandment, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. This really has to do with bearing false witness in court. And the 10th commandment, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or male or female slave or ox or donkey or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. You mustn't want what your neighbor has. This is similar to what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount when he says, you have heard it said, do not commit adultery, but I say to you, if any man who looks at a woman with lust in his heart has already committed adultery with her. That gets to this last commandment, the commandment about coveting. Okay, any questions about that? After that, we get more laws. In Leviticus and Deuteronomy, we get more laws. I think there are 613 laws, is that right? But you have to understand that the larger body of the law really grows out of the 10 Commandments, or what's called the Decalogue. And the laws, the purpose of the law is to keep people's life consistent with the way that God has ordered the world. Okay, so the universe isn't a morally neutral place. There's a moral fabric to the universe. And obeying the law is what keeps you in keeping with the way God wanted people to live. And so God says to them, I'm going to be your God, and I'm going to bless you. And your role is to live in a particular way that honors me. And that's why we call this the Sinai Covenant, because it's a binding pact between God and Israel. God's going to be their God, they're going to be His people, and there's going to be a particular way that they live in response to being the people of God. So their faithfulness as a people at this point is dependent upon the extent to which they abide by the law. Okay, so you can see here how this exodic narrative shapes the identity of the Israelite people as a people. Okay, I think that's probably it. Thank you.